Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you again. Just to summarize where we were up to, we were looking at the sugya of Kosher U'Matir, or more accurately, Kosher U'Matir, where you make a knot with intention to matir the knot. And even though there is a general rule with all melachos that you need a melacha shel kayama, the melacha needs a degree of permanence, and we saw the various sources that demonstrated this across other melachos like Kosef and Saveya and Boina and so on. Nonetheless, there is a unique feature with kosher that even if the knot is fundamentally kasher shel kayama, nonetheless, if it's al-manas lahatir, the intention is to undo it. It isn't enough to be the melacha. That's what the Gemara assumes in our sugya. And we demonstrated this was not a general rule across all melachos, but this was a melacha, a rule unique to kosher. In addition, even leaving aside the issue of al-manas lahatir, even the core issue of kasher shel kayama, a knot, or kasher she'eino shel kayama, an impermanent knot, has different rules to other melachos. Its degree of impermanence and the fact that if it is impermanent, it is mutter rather than being potter of asa. So model number one, which saw kosher as merely an example of a general rule with all melachos, proved to be incorrect. We're now going to go to model number two, which is going all the way to the opposite extreme. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, the correct model will be one that's a little bit of a compromise between the two. But attempt number two is to go to the opposite extreme and understand this to be purely a rule in what defines a kasher, nothing to do in principle with Hilchos Shabbos. So this isn't a Hilchos Shabbos rule at all. This is a rule in kasher, in knots in general, in what we define in Halacha as a kasher, as a knot, as opposed to it being something particular to Hilchos Shabbos. Now, in many areas of Torah, we find a definitional halacha, and in each case, we need to understand whether this is specific to this halacha or cross many halachas. And what we're suggesting here is that this is a definition across many halachas. This is more about the dictionary or halachic definition of what a kasher is, as opposed to something unique to Hilchos Shabbos. Let me give you an example from in Yom Adiyoma from Chanukah. So the concept of a bayis, a house or a home, appears in many halachas in the Torah. You have a bayis in Hilchos Chanukah, ner ish or beisai. That's as far as the core halacha is concerned. The obligation is on a bayis, a household, to light the menorah, and the Chanukiah, the menorah, has to be positioned in the bayis or linked to the bayis, whether inside or at the doorway, the Pesach bayis. But we find a bayis in Hilchos Mezuzah. Mezuzah, a bayis has a chiv in Mezuzah. We find a bayis in Hilchos Shabbos, with a bayis and a chatzah and a Rosh Hashanah and a Rosh Hashanah Yachid with respect to Erevin. We find a bayis in Hilchos Tzaras. There is a house which is menuga, which is it receives tzaras, just like a human can receive tzaras. There's a bayis hamenuga. So we find the concept of bayis across many halachas in the Torah, and therefore, whenever we learn a definition of bayis, we need to think whether this is transferable across all halachas. Is this unique to tzaras or mezuzah or Shabbos or Chanukah, or is this something about what defines a bayis in halacha? So this is the same sort of conversation that we're having over here with the kasher. The concept of kasher appears across many halachas, and therefore perhaps we made a mistake when we assumed this was unique to Hilchos Shabbos, and in fact what's really going on is a halacha unique to Hilchos kasher. Now, I attempted therefore to try and see other sugyas in Shas where kasher is a relevant halachic factor, and I unfortunately I'm not enough of a baki in halacha or Shas to have arrived at these sources myself. So these are collated from various collation works and works of late Achronim and so on, who draw my attention to various other halachas where the concept of kasher is discussed. And the first source is one which is specific, actually, specifically rather makes the connection between our sugya and Hilchos Shabbos and the halacha of kasher in a completely unrelated halacha. and this is with respect to the kasher shel tefillin. So tefillin need a kasher. Now, obviously, there are unique halachas around the kasher of tefillin. The tefillin need a particular sort of kasher, as we are aware, a particular sort of knot. However, the kasher is a kasher. First has to be a knot, and then has to be a particular sort of knot. So the Acharonim consider whether this knot needs to be a permanent one. This is discussed most specifically by the Avnei Nezer, though in truth, as we will see, it's really a discussion that already arises in the times of the Rishonim about whether a kasher made for tefillin has to be, or whether it's, the other way around, whether it is a kosher kasher for tefillin, whether it is a legitimate kosher kasher for tefillin, if it is made al manas lahati with intention to undo. And this scenario is very common. If someone gives them their tefillin to be checked by a sofa, or finds out that tefillin are apostle, or whatever it may be, and they need to borrow tefillin from someone else, they may wish to do and undo the knot on a regular basis, let's say daily. For example, if they want to fit it to their head size, the size of the tefillin shalosh strap is fairly sensitive. There's a particular position, has to be, the knot has to be positioned at the back, at the front has to be, the tefillin, the base of the tefillin should be no lower than one's hairline, or where one's hairline was. So there's a particular position of the tefillin, and according to the Avnei Nezer, there is an issue with creating the new kasher of the tefillin shalosh al manas lahatis. I borrowed tefillin from you for one day. You haven't got a problem. You put your tefillin on, and then you give it to me, and I adjust the knot with the intention to adjust it back to your size for tomorrow. So this is a kasher al manas lahatis. Argues the Avnei Nezer, based upon our sugya in Shabbos, that this kasher should be, or partly based, I should say, more accurately, on our sugya in Shabbos, that this kasher should be possible because this is not a kasher shel kayama. The other case in tefillin where one does and undoes kasher is, of course, the lefty. So someone who's left-handed, who needs to borrow tefillin from the majority population of right-handed people, and again wants to adjust it back again, they will do or undo the kasher of the shel yad. And the Avnei Nezer claims that this is a problem to go backwards and forward. So this is the first source that indicates that maybe what we're dealing with over here is a shas sugya. This isn't a sugya specific to Shabbos. This is a sugya about kasher, about the nature of knot. By the way, what would the svara be? The svara would be that a knot is a agent of chibur, of attaching, and the definition of an attachment is something that has a certain degree of permanence to it. By definition, if it's temporary, it isn't a chibur. That would be the svara. A kasher has to have a certain chashivas, a certain significance, and therefore, if it's either in its structure or in its intentionality a temporary kasher, this wouldn't be a kosher kasher. So says the Avnei Nezer. I want to mention this point that the halacha, this is not the case. The Avnei Nezer is very important in senior posek, and there are those who are machmir for his shitta, but certainly as far as core halacha is concerned, one does not need to be concerned about this, because in fact this is a topic of discussion amongst the Rishonim. I don't want to digress too far into tefillin, but this is important for our context because we're suggesting that this is a cross Torah halacha of kasher. By the way, this is something everyone can think about. Where else do we find a kasher in the Torah before I go on?
Tzitzit.
In tzitzit, absolutely. So the next example we look at will be tzitzit. This is another important halacha to look at whether a similar halacha applies with tzitzit. Any other suggestions? There's a third case where kasher applies. I did not get to this myself. I only got to it from reference books. So
is it sort of sideways with lulav?
Okay. So this is an interesting halacha. The igud shalulav, the binding of the lulav. The igud does not need in and of in itself a kasher. It needs a permanent binding, but not necessarily through a kasher. But that's a good that deserves to be noted down. As
we said kilayim, wouldn't it be in a sense? The context with the tzitzit kilayim is linked to.
Excellent. It is with kilayim. Kilayim is the third example. I see someone who spent time learning Mishnah Zoraim. Is that right, Adam? You've been doing Zoraim also, haven't you, with your Chavruta? Fantastic.
In the past, I'm on Tawat now. We're doing Noshim with Neil and Tawat with Woe.
Excellent. So you're absolutely right. The other scenario is Kilayim, and we'll come to that shortly. The Kilayim scenario. Well done. That's very impressive. So this is the so this is kasher shel tefillin. Now, just to very briefly mention some of the Mara Makomas with respect to tefillin, because it's fascinating how our Sukkot and Shabbos takes us to the rest of Shas. There is a pasuk in the Torah, and the pasuk says, that you should be kosher this to your hand. So believe it or not, there's a machlokas rishonim about whether you have to knot your tefillin every single day. There is a view in the rishonim, a view of one of the Rishonim called Rabbi Zobin, who's brought in the Mordechai. The Mordechai was is a Rishon on Ashkenazi Rishon, who collates a lot of otherwise relatively unknown sources, and he brings this view of Rabbi Eliyahu. He's also brought in the Tosfos, but the Mordechai discusses this at greater length. The Rabbeinu Eliyahu is of the opinion that the kasher shel tefillin has to be made every day, because this is the pasuk of Kshatam la'os al yodecha. So Rabbeinu Tam in Tosfos asks on this Rabbeinu Eliyahu, if that's the case, why can you not tie tefillin on Shabbos? The Gemara brings that it's also to tie tefillin on Shabbos, and asks Rabbeinu Tam if the tefillin need their knots to be redone every day, surely should be allowed to tie them on Shabbos. Now, there's something interesting about that question, because according to Rabbeinu Eliyahu, evidently this knot is a knot, because otherwise how can you be yoked to the mitzvah of tefillin? And on the other hand, says Rabbeinu Tam, you should be allowed to tie it on Shabbos because it's not a kasher shel kayama. Answers the Mordechai that this is good for the answer. Since the Torah says, according to Rabbeinu Eliyahu, that this is choshev a knot with respect to tefillin, then it would also be also on Shabbos. In other words, let's go the other way around. We who paskin that you don't tie your tefillin knot every single day, so argues the Avnei Nezer, according to us, the question would go in the reverse, and such. That's why you cannot tie such a knot on Shabbos, because it needs to be a permanent knot, and indeed a temporary knot would be possible for tefillin. However, according to Rabbeinu Eliyahu, that you need to retie the knot daily, Hagufa, such a knot would also be also on Shabbos. So this is a sort of source where you see the Rishonim already considering this idea about the permanence or temporariness of the knot. And Avnei Nezer's reading of the sources is that this is good for what Rabbeinu Eliyahu is saying. He's saying you have to tie the knot daily, and therefore at least the knot of tefillin, the Torah is machshiv such a knot as a knot, and therefore would also be also on Shabbos. However, as I said, the halacha, this is not the case. Again, I don't go into all the details, but there is rayas from various Rishonim, Tosfos, the Ramban, and others that a knot can be done daily, and the Mishnah Berurah brings this la halacha that you can alter the knot, and on the contrary, you should alter the knot if you borrow tefillin in order to ensure that the tefillin are tied and positioned correctly. The Mishnah Berurah actually says that it's not good practice to borrow tefillin daily. One should have one's own set of tefillin because we're worried that you won't readjust the knot accurately, indicating that in principle the readjustment of the knot is the correct thing to do, and he's not worried about the impermanence of it. So this is source number one. Source number two is Paul's source, which is an excellent one, Tzitzis. Tzitzis also have a kesher, and again, there's a discussion about the kesher she'ena shel kayama with respect to tzitzis. This finds its place in halacha with someone who discovers their tzitzis are undone on Shabbos. Is there a solution to tie one tzitzis? And the proposed solution is, well, make a kesher she'ena shel kayama, and make a temporary knot with intention to unravel it after Shabbos, and that way you can have the best of both worlds. Your tzitzis have a kesher, and the knot is, and you're not machal Shabbos because it's a kesher al manas lahati, or kosher al manas lahati. So this again is discussed in the poskim. The Mishnah Berurah discusses this, the Halacha, the Prima Godim, but again, in practical halacha, the Prima Godim seems to distinguish between the two and seems to learn that we should not learn one from the other. We can't extrapolate from tzitzis to Shabbos. The final example, which, as I said, I did not think of myself, and Adam did, which is excellent, is kilayim. The Shulchan Aruch discusses, I should specify which sort of kilayim we're talking about. Kilayim means mixtures. And there are many sorts of kilayim. Kilayim is not one set of halachas, it's numerous halachas. There's kilayim with plowing with animals together. There's kilayim with sowing seeds together. There's kilayim with having seeds in one's vineyard. There's kilayim with sharpness, what we call sharpness, wool and linen together. Adam, do you remember which sort of kilayim kasher comes up in? In the kilayim of sharpness. So the halacha and sharpness.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obviously it'd be sharpness.
The kasher of the kilayim of sharpness has the concept of a kasher in. Basically, without going into details, sharpness has to be, the threads have to be linked in some way. How are they linked? Whether they're woven together or twisted together, but they have to be linked in some way. And one of the methods of linking sharpness in order to transgress the prohibition of sharpness is if they are knotted together. And again, there the poskim can discuss the nature of this kasher and whether one is chayav if it's a kasher she'eno shel kayoma, if it's an impermanent kasher. Now, once again, even though there's a discussion amongst the poskim, and when I say discussion, I need to say there are senior poskim who hold that we can extrapolate from Shabbos to sharpness. For example, Rabbi Shlomo Eger, the son of Rabbi Kiva Eger, who has footnotes on the Shulchan Aruch, brings this view, and so on and so forth. Again, the halacha, it does not appear to be the case. The halacha appears that it's even a kasher she'eno shel kayama, impermanent knot, has problems of sharpness. So what's the summary of what we have said so far? We said that the concept of kasher comes up numerous places in Shas, not just in Hilchos Shabbos. We gave 3 examples in Hilchos Tzitzis, in Hilchos Tefillin, and in Hilchos Kilayim. And in all 3 cases, remarkably and beautifully, we find poskim considering the possibility that we should learn from Hilchos Shabbos that just like in Hilchos Shabbos, a kasher shel kayama, kosher u'matir is not a kasher. Similarly, in Hilchos sharpness, Tefillin or Tzitzis, it should not be counted as a kasher. So these poskim would evidently hold that our sugya is not a sugya in Hilchos Shabbos per se, it's a sugya in Hilchos kasher. In which case, we've resolved our previous conundrum. We asked, what is this halacha that kosher u'matir is not just potter, but even mutter in some cases? We're not going to go into the details of how we define knots. That's really a whole Perek and Shabbos later on. But at least conceptually, we find that a temporary knot with kasher is not a kasher. And we said this seems to have unusual features above and beyond the general rules of melachos. And the answer is, according to these poskim, that this is never meant to be understood as a halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. This was meant to be understood as a halacha in Hilchos kasher, in what defines a knot. It's a rule that a knot, which is amanas nahate, is not a knot, is not a kasher. And this would explain nicely why it is mutter rather than potter avalasa. Potter avalasa is a unique feature in Shabbos. In all Shabbos cases, potter means potter avalasa. The Chazal created a drabanon, a melacha that is not a melacha with a kiyum, is also midrabanon, despite the fact that min haTorah it is allowed. However, since this is a lomdus in kasher of kol haTorah kula, therefore it is mutter. So it appeared to be the case according to these poskim. Nonetheless, as I've tried to demonstrate, these poskim are no doubt a minority in the halachas of each sugya, and halacha l'maisa in each of the 3 cases, we don't paskin like them. In other words, the Avnei Nezer is an important posik. One should own one's own tefillin and not switch backwards and forwards. And there are those who are machmir for the view of the Avnei Nezer to worry about temporary knots. Nonetheless, the Mishnah Berurah, who is the posik achron in this area, is not concerned with the view of the Avnei Nezer. Similarly with Kilayim, La Halacha, this Rabbi Shlomo Eger, again, a very, very important Maramakom in the source, but not La Halacha. And finally, in Hilchos Tzitzis, again, the Biur Halacha does not seem to concur with this proposed lomdus that a kasher she'eno shel kayama should be insufficient for Hilchos Tzitzis. So the consensus of poskim is that this is not a kol haTorah kula din. It's not a din in kasher. This is a din unique to Hilchos Shabbos. So this forces us to the middle position, which is neither of the 2 extremes which I initially came into the sugya assuming. And I've simply tried to retrace with you the journey I went on in trying to understand the sugya. For a long time in the sugya, I assumed this was a general rule and application, the general rule in all melachos. We've seen that this is wrong. And then swung to the opposite extreme, that this is a unique halacha in kosher. And as I said, try to work my way through likut safarim to try and find other examples of such halachas. But it would appear that the correct answer over here is that this is indeed unique to kasher. However, it's unique to the melacha of kasher. So we can now have our cake and eat it. This is a hilchos Shabbos din. It's a din in melachos. However, it's not a din in all melachos. It's a din that is unique to melachos kosher. And this is the middle position, which really combines the two things that we said up to now. Why is this unique to kasher? Because the essence of kasher is a certain sort of chibur, a certain sort of attachment or joining. Perhaps only somewhat similar, and we'll look at this later, to toifa, to sewing, but certainly different to all other melachos. And even with toifa, we discussed that length and kasher is different to toifa, it's a different melacha. Knotting and sewing are different melachos. Toifa includes a third party which unifies the two and various other distinctions that we saw. So for now, we'll just talk about kosher. This is a unique halacha in kosher, or kasher, but only with respect to Hilchos Shabbos. With respect to tefillin, tzitzis, and kalayim, the main question is functionality. Does this join the two together? And the answer is yes, and therefore this is enough for the kasher of tefillin, the kasher of tzitzis, and the kasher of kalayim. With respect to the melacha of kasher, however, melachos need to be an achievement, an outcome, an alteration of the world. The whole concept of melacha is a creative engagement with producing a creative result. With melachos, we find unique features that they have to have a certain chashivos and significance. Indeed, this is why with all melachos, there's a degree of kiyum that you need. However, with kasher is unique, that the degree of kiyum and permanence needed is above and beyond that which is needed by other melachos. So with all other melachos, there's a relatively lighter bar or threshold to be crossed for it to achieve the status of a kiyum. With melachos kasher, which is all about chibur and attachment, the kiyum needs to be a more permanent one. So this is indeed a svara in Hilchos Shabbos. Melachos need a chashivos, a significance. We find that when a melacha lacks a chashivos, for example, it's a kilkul, it's destructive, or other such things, it doesn't have the significance of a melacha. But however, in each melacha, we need to apply it as it is appropriate for that melacha. And the Gemara understood that when it comes to the application of the general principle of chashivos for melachos, the kiyum, the threshold needed to cross the bar and for it to be considered a significant enough chibur that's created is higher with kasher than with other melachos. And for that reason, this is a unique halacha in Hilchos kosher that it needs, that on the nas lahatir doesn't cross the threshold. So in answer to our initial question, why is it that melachos kosher on nas lahatir is not just potter but mutter? Why is it? What's the basis of the allowance? The answer is, in a very broad brushstroke sense, it's to do with the chashivos of a melacha, that melachos need permanence. And in a specific sense, it's chashivos of the melacha unique to melachos kosher as opposed to all other melachos. And this is the synergy, the middle path between the two extremes that we initially chose. Initially, we only were looking at melacha and thought it was a subcategory of the general rule of all melachos. Then we only looked at kasher and thought it was just about the shem kasher. And the answer is it's about the both together. It's about melachos kasher, the uniqueness of kasher. Now, I have to confess that I don't really understand where the Gemara got this from. Meaning, how is the Gemara so confident that kasher has this unique feature? And just to remind ourselves, at the beginning of the sugya, there is a source for kasher being a melacha from the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, they engaged in kosher manas lahatir, which is tying the urias to the asedas, tying the cloth to the pegs. Nonetheless, the Gemara says that can't be a melacha because we are sure it doesn't have the chashivas. So the Gemara Misvara, in its own reasoning, is confident that kasher is different to other melachos and needs a degree of permanence. All we have done here is reverse engineer. Sometimes in a sugya, we are zeicha, we merit to achieve an outcome where we are able to retrace the thing in the Gemara and understand the distinction the Gemara is drawing. In this case over here, it's simply an act of reverse engineering. It's clear and evident, if we've learned the sugya right, that we have understood what the Gemara is saying, defined correctly what the Gemara is saying, that understands that melacha of kosher needs a degree of permanence beyond other melachas, and this is a Sora in Hilchos Shabbos uniquely applicable to kosher. However, why because of this lomdus of the chibur, why is it obvious and reasonable and intuitive to the Gemara that the Gemara has a svara to say that this can't be a malacha, even though we find it in the Mishkan? That I don't know. So we've achieved a half outcome in the sugya. We've heard correctly the distinction the sugya is telling us, but I personally haven't heard in this why the Gemara is so sure of this. It doesn't have a posset for this. There's no particular source. The Gemara says, "Misvara, this can't be a malacha when it comes to kasher." I want to finish for today just by saying that there is a related discussion in the Rishonim about tefira, a tofa, a sewing, which is Ein Shel Kirama. It's the melacha which is most similar to kosher, albeit different. Many of the Rishonim don't believe there's such a rule with tofa. We don't find a clean source for this. However, there are Rishonim that say there is, and the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch and Shin Yod Zayin discusses this very issue about the application of the principle of kiyum with tofa. We're not going to go into this in detail. We will wait till we learn the relevant sugya of that, but I just want to mention that this is a general, that there is some discussion about applying or extending this to tofa, and the logic would be because both of them have this quality of chibur, of being about connectivity. I'll stop here for today because we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I don't want to start the next sub-sugya. Just to remind you, there is no shiur on Tuesday, but there will be a shiur next Sunday, and I will send out more sources in advance of that. So those who are able to learn Tuesday, if they are able to do so, and if not, at least Sunday, because after that we will be taking a break until January. We'll have a couple of weeks off. I'd like to try and finish the melachot of kosher on between private learning on Tuesday and then shiur on Sunday. Depending how things go, maybe we'll give a slightly longer shiur on Sunday I'll have to see the timings and whether I can work that out. But I wish everyone a good Hanukkah.
Can I ask a quick question? Can I ask a quick question? So we've left this in a place where we don't really understand why, but do you have any savara why we don't apply this al-manas lahater to other malachas? For example, if I heat up a kettle with the intention to let it cool down again, or I write with the intention to rub it out straight away afterwards, why is that still a malacha? So it would appear that with all other melachas, so that in fact your two examples are good ones because each one needs to be worked out in its own context. With kosev, and we discussed kosev because kosev there is a lomdus of kiyum. However, the determinant is the fundamental structure as opposed to intentionality. So that's with kosev. In a sense, your question is retracing our original discussion, in which I initially assumed this Gemara was an application of a general rule. When we saw this general rule is not clearly and obviously applicable to other melachas, where it depends on fundamentally whether the ksav has a kiyum, as opposed to my intentionality. There are cases where you are parted with kosev because fundamentally it doesn't have a kiyum, like old-fashioned fax paper type writing. However, the halacha, or writing on mist on a glass or something like that. However, the halacha, intentionality isn't the determinant, but intrinsic structure. The second thing is you need to look at each malacha in its own way. So with heating, for example, things cool down. That is the nature of heat, and therefore this is the appropriate degree of permanence for heat. But you're correct. The best svara I have, partly derived from tofa in the discussion of Rishonim whether to do with tofa, is that this is a unique halacha and chibur. Other changes that one makes have such a significance that even if my intention is to remove them, nonetheless, for now, they have significance. I think one can see that intuitively with something like kosev. Something like kosev, there's writing there, there's communication. This is something of a significance. It carries information. And there, even if my intention is to erase it, nonetheless, in the meantime, it has a significance. Whereas chibur, it's a chiddush a little bit, that chibur is a malacha at all. Because chibur is taking two objects, and the whole chashivas of the malacha is the knotting them together. There's no fundamental change in the sort of fabric of reality in the same way as there is with some of the other malachas. And therefore the Gemara has a svara that this needs a higher degree of permanence than other malachas. Beyond that, I have nothing to say, and that's my point. I don't understand why it's so obvious to the Gemara. I can sort of retrace it and
define the difference that the Gemara is zooming in on, but why the Gemara thinks this difference is important, I don't know.
Sure.
Okay, have a good day, everyone.
Very much indeed. Shkoyach.
Yeah, thank you.
Hanukkah Sameach.